Chapter 1. The Night They Told Me to Move Out. For years, I paid for my family's comfort, the bills, the repairs, the emergencies no one wanted to touch. Then one night, they told me I could sleep on the couch or move out. Months later, I discovered the house had a second mortgage, their retirement savings were gone, and every document had already been signed. Legally, I was out. Financially, they were trapped. The moment I said no changed everything. I'm ends.Dinchant, and this is what happened when I stopped saving people who never wanted to be saved. It started like any other weeknight in the suburbs, the kind that slips by without leaving a mark. The streetlights along Willow Creek Drive had just come on, one by one, washing the pavement in a dull amber glow. Inside the house, the kitchen lights were too bright, the kind that flatten shadows and make everything feel exposed. Dinner was already on the table. Plates were warm, silverware clicked softly against ceramic as someone adjusted a fork. The air smelled of roasted chicken and something buttery, familiar and heavy. Nothing about the evening warned me that it was about to redraw the shape of my life. I am Rachel Morgan. I was 42 that year. I worked as a regulatory compliance manager for a regional utilities company based out of Des Moines, the kind of job where you learn to speak carefully and listen even more carefully. I had moved back into my parents' house years earlier, not because I had failed, but because they needed help. I covered most of the expenses: electricity, water, insurance, repairs that always seemed urgent. What I did not own was the house itself. The deed and the mortgage were in my parents' names. Legally, I was a guest. I understood that fact in theory. I just did not realize how quickly it would be used to erase me. My younger brother, Evan, sat across from me, leaning back in his chair as if the space already belonged to him. He was 38, confident in a way that never seemed tied to results. Beside him was his wife, Lila Grant, 35, polished and alert. Her hair was perfectly styled, her phone lay face up on the counter like it had always lived there. She set her purse on the chair by the door without asking, slipped her jacket over the back of the sofa, and glanced around the room as if mentally rearranging it. None of it was overt, all of it was intentional. Lila spoke first. She did not frame it as a question. She smiled and said they were moving in, not for a few weeks, not to regroup, moving in permanently. She said it lightly, like she was sharing a plan everyone else had already agreed to. Evan nodded, his eyes flicking toward our father instead of me. My father, Thomas, was 69, recently retired, his posture stiff with the kind of tired that does not show up on the outside. He had always been good at making decisions sound neutral, like they existed outside of emotion. He cleared his throat and said we needed to talk about arrangements, about space, about what made sense now. My mother, Diane, sat at the end of the table. Her hands were folded in her lap. She stared at the edge of her plate, her jaw tight. I recognized that posture immediately. It was the same one she had worn my entire life whenever conflict appeared. Silence, she had learned, kept the peace, or at least postponed the explosion. This was not the first time she had chosen not to look at me when something mattered. Thomas finally spoke again, his voice even, almost gentle. He said I could move into the living room or I could move out. No explanation, no hesitation, just those two options, laid out like a practical solution. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the house, the air conditioner kicked on. I waited for someone to say something else, to soften it, to ask how that would work. No one did. Evan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Lila watched me closely, her head tilted slightly, her expression calm, curious, almost amused. My mother did not raise her eyes. I thought about the nights I had come home late from work, still answering emails as I unlocked the door. The weekends I had spent coordinating repairs, arguing with insurance adjusters, transferring money without telling anyone because it was easier that way. I thought about how often I had chosen convenience over confrontation. I did not mention any of it. I did not defend myself. Something in me understood with startling clarity that listing my sacrifices would not change the outcome. It would only make the dismissal sting more. I stood up and said I would pack my things. I said I would leave tonight. My father looked surprised just briefly, as if he had expected me to negotiate. He did not stop me. Evan exhaled, relief pass across his face. Lila did not move. I walked down the hallway to the bedroom I had moved back into years earlier. The carpet creaked softly beneath my feet. I packed quickly, clothes into bags, documents into boxes. I left behind anything that had never truly been mine. I unplugged the television I had bought myself. I dragged the couch from the den, the one I had paid for when the old one collapsed. No one offered to help me. No one asked me to stay. As I carried the last box toward the front door, I passed the dining room again. Evan and Lila were already talking about where they would put their things. My father listened. My mother glanced up at me, her eyes flickering with something I could not name. Regret, fear, habit. She did not speak. Outside, the night air was cooler. Crickets filled the silence. I loaded my car slowly, the weight of each box settling into my arms. Before I got in, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. For a moment, I considered going back inside, explaining, asking for fairness. The thought passed as quickly as it came. There was nothing left to explain. Lila stepped into the doorway then, her arms crossed. She did not say goodbye, she simply watched me, a faint smile on her lips that told me this was finished, that I was leaving with nothing but boxes and pride. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. The porch light glowed warmly behind me, the house looking exactly as it had always done, safe, familiar. As it disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not grief, clarity. Paying for something doesn't mean you own it. Caring for people doesn't mean they will choose you, and sacrifice, when it goes unquestioned, does not create loyalty. It creates expectation. That night was not the end of anything. It was the first clean cut, sharp and quiet, and once it was made, there was no going back. Chapter 2. The Years I Paid for Their Comfort. The clarity did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly in the weeks after I left, as the silence of my apartment gave me space to look backward without flinching. Once the door had closed behind me, I could finally trace the shape of what had been happening for years. I moved back into my parents' house in the spring of 2016. My father had just retired from his job with the city, and the shift from steady paychecks to fixed income rattled them more than they admitted. The roof began to leak that first year, then the furnace failed during a cold snap. Insurance premiums rose, utility bills climbed higher every season. I told myself it was a temporary gap, something I could bridge until they adjusted. Every month followed the same rhythm. Late at night, after work, I sat at the kitchen table with only the overhead light on, the rest of the house dark and quiet. I logged into my bank account and made the transfers. Electricity, water, gas, property insurance. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as I checked each payment off my list. The house stayed warm, the lights stayed on. Everything worked because I made sure it did. The house itself remained in my parents' names. I never questioned that. I did not ask to be added to the deed or the mortgage. In my mind, helping did not require ownership. It required reliability. I believed that was enough. My brother, Evan, was already chasing ideas by then. One year it was a logistics concept he swore would disrupt the market. The next it was a mobile app that never moved past sketches. He spoke with confidence, always just one step away from success. My father listened with patience. My mother smiled and said encouragement mattered. When Evan needed money, it was never called that. My father would say he was trying. My mother would say he needed support. I would hear these conversations while I reviewed bills on my laptop. No one asked me directly to fund Evan. By covering the household expenses, I made room for everything else to continue as it was. Once, I asked whether we should talk about boundaries, about who was responsible for what. My father waved it off. He told me stability mattered more than fairness. He said I was dependable, and that was a gift. My mother nodded and said things would settle down soon. They always said soon. By 2018, the maintenance issues became routine: plumbing in the basement, new insulation before winter, medical bills my parents did not want to discuss. I paid them without comment. Sometimes, after writing a check, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the dark window, listening to the house settle around me. It felt like everything was being held together by quiet, invisible effort. Nothing settled down. Evan married Leela in 2020. She entered the family with a kind of ease that filled space without asking permission. She talked about real estate consulting, about connections and deals, about how money flowed differently if you understood leverage. Her clothes were expensive. Her phone was always the latest model. When I asked which firm she worked with, she answered vaguely, saying it depended on the project and the timing. At family dinners, Leela steered the conversation. She spoke about improvements the house could use, about upgrades that would increase value. My parents listened closely. Evan deferred to her without hesitation. Decisions started happening in side conversations I was not part of. When the water heater failed that winter, I suggested that Evan and Leela might help cover the replacement. Evan laughed awkwardly and said he was still getting his footing. Leela smiled and said everything would pay off soon. My father changed the subject. I paid the bill. Around that same time, my work life began to reflect my home life in ways I could no longer ignore. At the utilities firm, I was the one who handled problems before they became crises. If a compliance issue surfaced late on a Friday, it landed on my desk. If a report was overdue, I stayed late to finish it. Once, just before midnight, I answered an email about an environmental audit that someone else had missed, simply because I knew the consequences if it slipped. My colleague Maya noticed. Over coffee one morning, she told me I always fixed messes that were not mine. She said it gently, like a concern rather than a critique. I shrugged and said it was easier to do it myself than explain it. She raised an eyebrow and said, "Easier for who?" I did not have an answer. By 2021, exhaustion pushed me to look more closely at my finances, not out of suspicion, but out of fatigue. I opened old statements and added the numbers year by year. The total startled me. It was far beyond what I had ever allowed myself to see. This was not temporary help. This was substitution. I had quietly replaced responsibilities that belonged to others. I tried to speak to my mother about it once. I chose my words carefully, suggested we make a plan. She listened, then asked me not to push. She said Evan was sensitive right now. She said things were delicate. She asked me to keep the peace. That phrase followed me home. At another dinner, Leela talked excitedly about a real estate deal she was advising on. She dropped numbers casually, without context. My parents were impressed. Evan looked proud. I asked a simple question about financing. She waved it away and said it was complicated. No one pressed her. A quiet warning settled in my chest, the kind you feel before something breaks. The realization came late one night in my apartment, long after I had moved out. I sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop open, bank statements spread across the screen, years of payments lined up in neat rows. I finally named what I had been doing. I was not helping. I was absorbing. I was holding the weight so no one else had to feel it. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of my own refrigerator. For the first time, I understood the mistake I had been making. I had confused responsibility with self-erosion. And once I saw that truth clearly, there was no way to return to not seeing it. Chapter 3. The Truth No One Wanted to Hear.
I did not become suspicious all at once. What changed was my attention. Once I stopped explaining things away, the small details began to stack up, quiet and persistent, until ignoring them felt louder than listening. The first step was a call I almost talked myself out of making. Laura Bennett and I had gone to college together years ago. She practiced real estate law in Kansas City now, close enough to understand the Midwest market, far enough to speak plainly. I told her I had a question, nothing urgent, just something that did not sit right. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning in a place with big windows and steady foot traffic, neutral ground where conversations stayed measured. I explained the situation carefully. My parents' house, my brother and his wife, the consulting work that never seemed to land anywhere solid, the upgrades and financial moves that did not line up. Laura listened without interrupting, stirring her coffee slowly. When I finished, she told me she could not give legal advice. Then she paused and said she had seen that company name before, not in headlines, not in lawsuits, just in appraisal reviews. Midwest Properties, deals that passed initial checks but raised questions when someone looked closer. She did not accuse anyone, she did not say fraud, she said to be careful. She said people often signed documents without understanding what they committed to. When we stood up to leave, I noticed my phone vibrating on the table, a missed call from my mother. As I walked to my car in the parking lot, I felt it clearly for the first time, that something had already been set in motion. A week later, my work life crossed into it in a way that made my stomach drop. I was at my desk late, the office nearly empty, fluorescent lights humming softly above me. I was reviewing compliance reports when my phone rang. The number belonged to Daniel Ross, a compliance officer at a regional bank we worked with from time to time. His tone was professional and restrained. He said he was calling about a file that had crossed his desk and wanted to confirm something unrelated to my role. He did not give details. He did not have to. He mentioned an address, my parents' address. He asked if I was affiliated in any way. I told him no. I told him the house was not in my name. There was a pause on the line, long enough for my fingers to go cold on the keyboard. He thanked me and said that was all he needed. When the call ended, the office felt suddenly too quiet. My heart was racing, my hands unsteady. Whatever was happening had moved beyond family disagreement. It had entered systems that did not care about intent or loyalty. I decided to speak up, not dramatically, not with accusations. I chose a Sunday afternoon when everyone was home, when the house felt calm enough to hold a conversation without exploding. I said we needed to talk. I said there were things I did not understand. I mentioned appraisals and loans. I asked what paperwork had been signed. My father frowned and said I was overthinking it. He said Leela handled the details and knew what she was doing. My mother reached for my arm and asked me to stop. She said everything was stressful enough already. Evan crossed his arms and said I always had to complicate things. Leela smiled. She said I worried too much. She said restructuring finances was normal. She said this was how people built security. Her voice was calm and confident, the kind that made doubt sound unreasonable. I asked to see the paperwork. My father shook his head and said it was handled. Evan said we already took care of it. My mother said, please, not now. The room felt smaller. I could feel the familiar pull to smooth things over, to step back into the role I had always played. I asked one more question. I asked if they had signed everything themselves. Leela answered before anyone else could. She said of course they had. She said no one forced them. She said they were adults and capable of making decisions. That was the moment something shifted. Quietly, irreversibly. I understood then that the documents were already signed. Whatever obligations those signatures created existed now, whether I agreed with them or not. I was not being asked to prevent a mistake. I was being asked to stay silent about one. I left shortly after. There was no resolution, no compromise, just an unspoken agreement that I had crossed an invisible line. Over the next few days, more pieces fell into place: missed calls, short answers, attention that lingered even when no one spoke. I thought about Laura, about Daniel, about how systems moved once they were engaged. I considered pushing harder, calling lawyers, demanding transparency. I knew how easily I could step back into the role of fixer and buffer. But I also knew something else. You cannot save people who believe they have already won. You cannot protect those who refuse to look at what they have signed. So I stopped asking questions. I stopped offering help. I let the silence stretch. When my mother called later that week, her voice tight, I listened. When Evan texted to say I was being unfair, I did not respond. When Leela sent a brief message telling me not to interfere, I understood exactly what she meant. I was not afraid. I was aware. And that awareness came with a decision. I would not chase the truth down for people who had chosen not to hear it. I would not drown trying to pull someone to shore who insisted the water was fine. For the first time, I stayed quiet not out of habit, but out of clarity. I knew then that whatever was coming would arrive on its own.
Chapter 4. When Karma Arrived Without Me. What came next did not arrive as a single blow. It came the way real consequences usually do, in pieces, spaced just far enough apart to keep hope alive a little longer than it deserved. The first sign was a letter in my parents' mailbox. My mother mentioned it casually when she called, her voice tight but trying to sound normal. She said it was probably nothing, just another notice, just paperwork. I could hear the envelope being opened on the other end of the line. When I asked who it was from, she hesitated before answering. The bank. After that, the calls started coming later in the evening. Numbers my parents did not recognize. Voicemails they listened to twice and still did not understand. My father said he spent almost an hour on hold before someone finally spoke to him. He said they asked questions that made him feel foolish. He said Vanessa told him not to worry. I did not interrupt. I listened. I remembered the choice I had already made. 2 weeks later, Daniel Ross called again. This time there was no small talk. His voice was precise, careful, the way it gets when everything is already documented. He said he was contacting me in an official capacity. I sat down at my kitchen table before he continued, already bracing myself. He told me there was a second mortgage on my parents' house, $265,000. The paperwork was complete. The funds had been released months earlier. He also told me that nearly $198,000 had been withdrawn from my parents' retirement accounts. The withdrawals were authorized. The signatures matched. I asked him who initiated it. He said he could not disclose that. He said all parties had signed willingly. He said the bank was required to move forward. When the call ended, I stayed seated, staring at the surface of the table as if it might move. My chest felt tight, my hands numb. This was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call. This was not a delay. This was structure, permanent, built while I was no longer inside the house. The confrontation happened a few days later. My father called and asked me to come by. His voice sounded older than I remembered. I drove over without planning what I would say. Everyone was there when I arrived. My parents sat on the couch with papers spread across the coffee table. Evan paced near the window, running his hands through his hair over and over. Vanessa stood at the kitchen counter with her arms crossed, her posture stiff, defensive. My father looked up at me and said they needed help. He said he did not understand how this had happened. He said the numbers did not make sense. I asked one question. Who arranged the loans? Vanessa answered immediately. Everyone agreed, she said. We needed liquidity. This is how people protect their assets.
Her voice was sharper now, stripped of the calm confidence she usually wore. Evan stopped pacing and turned toward her. "You said it was temporary," he said. "You said there was no real risk." "I explained everything," she snapped. "You signed the documents." My father stared down at the papers in front of him. His hands were shaking. My mother sat beside him, silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence she had relied on for years now filled the room with regret. I asked to see the statements. I read them slowly. The second mortgage, the retirement withdrawals, the fees, the timelines. Everything was there. Clear. Final. Evan dropped into a chair and covered his face with his hands. "I trusted you," he said quietly. Vanessa laughed, short and bitter. "Trust goes both ways," she said. "You are only panicking now because it is uncomfortable." My father finally looked at me. His eyes were wet, searching. "We cannot lose this house," he said. "We need help." That was the moment everything shifted. That was the moment the conversations stopped circling around me and landed directly on me. The moment they were no longer explaining, but asking. I felt it immediately, the old instinct rising up, fast and familiar. My mind started calculating before I told it to stop. Payment plans, loans, negotiations. I had done this before. I knew how to make impossible numbers stretch. I took a breath. I remembered the nights at the kitchen table, the quiet transfers, the years of absorbing weight so no one else had to feel it. I felt my chest tighten, my hands curl against my knees, and then I let the breath out. "I cannot fix this," I said. My voice did not shake. I did not raise it. I did not apologize. I cannot take responsibility for decisions I did not make. My father asked what they were supposed to do. I said they needed to speak to a lawyer. I said they needed to work with the bank. I said I would not be involved financially. The room went silent. Evan stared at me like someone he did not recognize. My mother finally spoke, her voice small. "Family helps each other," she said. "This is different." "It is not different," I said. "It is exactly the same." Vanessa scoffed. "So you're walking away now that things are hard. You never supported us." I did not respond to her. I looked at Evan. "I love you, but I cannot save you from this." I looked at my parents. "I hope you find a way through." Then I left. The calls came later that night, then the texts. Evan asked me to reconsider. My mother asked me to think about what would happen if they lost the house. Vanessa sent a message telling me I had no right to judge decisions I did not understand. I did not reply. Over the following weeks, everything unfolded exactly as Daniel had warned. Notices escalated, deadlines closed, options narrowed. The system moved forward indifferent to emotion or intention. I watched from a distance, not without feeling, but without interference. This was not revenge. This was consequence. Karma does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through paperwork, through timelines and clauses, through processes that don't bend for tears or explanations. I did not cause this. I did not stop it. I simply did not absorb it. When the house finally went quiet again, when the calls slowed, and there was nothing left for me to do, I sat alone in my apartment and let the silence settle. I knew the next part of my life would be quieter than this, and for the first time, that felt like relief.
Chapter 5. The Life I Chose Without Apologizing. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned. I moved into a small apartment downtown not long after everything finally settled. It sat above a bakery that opened early and closed early, the kind of place where mornings smelled like bread and evenings stayed calm. The space was modest: one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, one window that caught the late afternoon light just before the sun dipped behind the buildings. It was not impressive.
It did not need to be. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's expectations. I was not suddenly richer. My bank account did not transform overnight. I still checked prices at the grocery store. I still planned carefully, but my body felt lighter. I slept through the night. I stopped waking up with my jaw clenched. I no longer checked my phone every few minutes, waiting for the next problem to solve. The silence was no longer something I filled with responsibility. It was something I rested inside. My mornings became predictable in the best way. I woke to the sound of delivery trucks outside the bakery. I made coffee slowly. I stood by the window while the city came alive one light at a time. No one needed anything from me yet. That simple truth felt like freedom. At work, things shifted in ways I had not expected. I stopped volunteering for tasks that were not mine. When an issue landed on my desk that belonged to another department, I redirected it calmly. I said, "This is outside my scope." I said, "I can clarify expectations, but I will not take this on." I did not justify myself. I did not over-explain. No one punished me. Instead, something else happened. Meetings became clearer. Responsibilities were defined instead of implied. People stopped assuming I would absorb whatever fell through the cracks. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside and told me it was good to see me focusing on the role I was actually hired to do. I nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to hear that. I had spent years believing boundaries would cost me everything. They did not. They gave me shape. Most evenings, I cooked for myself. Simple meals, food I liked, eaten slowly. I sat at the small table by the window and watched the city wind down. Sometimes I took walks after sunset, letting my thoughts drift without trying to fix them. There was no agenda, no calculation, just movement and air. News about my family came in fragments. The house went into foreclosure. The process unfolded the way it always does, quietly and without mercy. Papers were filed, deadlines passed. They packed what they could and moved into a rental on the edge of town. I did not ask for details. I did not need them. I felt sadness. I allowed it. I did not turn it into guilt. A few weeks later, my mother called and asked if we could talk. Her voice sounded tired, smaller somehow. I agreed. We met at a diner halfway between our neighborhoods. She arrived early and sat with her hands folded on the table. When I sat down, she reached for my hand, hesitated, then pulled back. She told me that she had been afraid of conflict her whole life. She said she thought keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. She admitted that silence had felt safer than confrontation. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. I listened. When she finished, she looked at me and waited. I told her I understood her fear. I told her I knew how easy it was to confuse endurance with love. I told her that I loved her. Then I told her I could not live the way she had lived. I said understanding did not mean repeating the same sacrifice. I said loving someone did not require disappearing in the process. She nodded slowly. There was no argument, no defense, just the quiet recognition that something had ended. We hugged before we left. It was brief, honest, enough. After that, the calls became less frequent. Birthdays, holidays, occasional updates. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just distance that stayed respectful. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel like I had won. What I felt was steady. I learned that peace does not announce itself. It does not arrive with applause or validation. It arrives quietly when you stop proving your worth through exhaustion. It settles in when you stop apologizing for choosing yourself. I stopped explaining decisions that were no longer up for debate. I let other people feel disappointed without rushing to fix it. I let silence exist without filling it. The life I built was not loud. It did not need to be. It was mine. Some nights, I sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. I thought about how easily I could have stayed in that house, absorbing everything until there was nothing left. I thought about how close I came to mistaking survival for loyalty. I did not regret leaving. I regretted waiting so long to believe I was allowed to. If you're listening to this and standing at the edge of a similar choice, one that asks you to pick yourself even when it feels selfish, even when it disappoints the people you love, I want to leave you with this. When the cost of staying is your peace, what would it look like to choose yourself without apologizing? And if you've ever had to set that boundary, or if you're still deciding whether you can, I would love to know your story.